I'm John Fugelsang. This is Viewpoint. Good evening. It's been called the last resort of the powerless prisoner, the hunger strike. And since February, a major hunger strike has been building momentum among the Muslim detainees at the military detention center at Guantanamo Bay. Now, this hunger strike began as a response to what the detainees described as raids by guards where copies of the Quran were mishandled. And since then, it's grown into a protest against the Obama administration's policy of holding the vast majority of detainees indefinitely while doing nothing to arrange transfer to their home countries or to put them on trial. Of the 166 detainees held at Guantanamo, 86 have been cleared for release, yet continue to rot in jail, while only 6 are facing military commissions. And right now there are around 100 detainees on hunger strike, including 23 who are now being force-fed twice a day. On Monday, the Pentagon sent around 40 additional medical personnel to Guantanamo to help with this force feeding. I'm going to explain what this is because your taxes are paying for it. It requires strapping prisoners to a chair so a tube might be passed through their noses and into their stomachs for an hour or two while liquid food stuff is dripped down. Dr. Jeremy Lazarus is president of the American Medical Association, and he wrote Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel last week, saying in part, and I quote, "Forced feeding of detainees violates core ethical values of the medical profession. Every competent patient has the right to refuse medical intervention, including life-sustaining interventions." And at his news conference on Tuesday, President Obama recommitted to an unfulfilled promise from the 2008 campaign.
I said we need to close Guantanamo. I continue to believe that we've got to close Guantanamo. Now, Congress determined that they would not let us close it. And despite the fact that there are a number of the folks who are currently in Guantanamo who the courts have said could be returned to their country of origin or potentially a third country.
And Congress still objects to closing Guantanamo. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell told reporters, and I quote, "There is a wide bipartisan opposition in Congress to the president's goal of moving those terrorists to American cities and towns. Actually, they would be held in maximum security federal prisons." As for the hunger strike, Mr. Obama addressed that too.
I don't want these individuals to die. Obviously, the Pentagon is trying to manage the situation as best as they can. But I think all of us should reflect on why exactly are we doing this? Why are we doing this?
At this point, it might be fair to say that we aren't doing this, Mr. President. You and Congress are, in all of our names. For more, I'm joined by Carlos Warner, an assistant federal public defender who represents 11 detainees at the Guantanamo Bay prison. Counselor Warner, welcome back to Viewpoint.
Thank you for having me again, John.
What a pleasure. So when did you last speak to your clients, and are any of your clients on hunger strike?
Yes, we believe, I represent 11. We believe 10 of them are hunger striking, although we can't say for sure because it's very hard to communicate in Guantanamo nowadays. The one that's not is a high-value detainee. I'd like to go straight to the President's remarks, though, but I'm more than happy to tell you about the pain of being force-fed, for sure.
Well, please do both. What would you like to say about the President's remarks?
He said, right there, he's blaming Congress, and he said Congress has prevented it. And what needs to be very clear here is under the current version of the NDAA, he has the absolute power to transfer individuals right now. So he does not have to go to Congress, and that's a red herring. That has been his party line because it appeases the left. But the left has to understand that he can transfer these innocent men, especially the 86 cleared prisoners, tomorrow if he wanted to. The right built in the ability to do so. And then you had Senator McConnell in talking about moving people to the United States. That's not what we're talking about. That restriction remains, and we can talk about what needs to happen with the remainder, but we got to start with the 86. We got to get them to third-party countries or to their own countries as soon as possible so we can start unwinding this down, because he's right. What are we doing here? I don't know what we're doing here, but whatever we're doing is un-American.
It's deeply un-American and unconstitutional, and what we're doing is nothing. How do your clients, sir, describe the process of force feeding?
Well, we've gotten it in very graphic detail, and the bottom line is that, as you said, they're strapped down from head to toe. They can't move. The process takes anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. And my clients claim that they're using a tube that's too large, a size 10 tube, and it takes several times for this tube to be inserted correctly by the staff, and each time it's painful. My client said that once it passes the nasal passage, it feels on the sinuses like a razor blade, and his eyes start to water. And as it reaches his throat, the gag reflex starts, and it's difficult to breathe because it presses against the esophagus, in the esophagus against the windpipe. And as it hits his stomach, he said this is the most excruciating part because the fluid is pumped in. Sometimes if it's pumped in too fast, he'll vomit. Even when it's pumped in and it stays down, he says after 84 days, the hunger pangs are gone. But because he's being force-fed, they come back. And during this, the military's telling him, hey, you have a choice. You can have a hot meal if you want. Oh, you don't want one? Okay, here we go. So this is barbaric. It's torturous. It's a clear violation of all medical ethics. Human rights groups have called for a stop to it, and the UN has called for a stop to it. But it's happening right now. The military is doing it right now to people in Guantanamo. And
it has been called torture by multiple sources. It's worth pointing out that things had kind of calmed down in Guantanamo for a few years until the new commander, Colonel John Bogdan, took over and resumed this practice of searching Korans. What are the hunger strikers' demands at this point, sir? What's it going to take for the hunger strikes to stop?
I thought that by this time the demand would switch to indefinite detention, but the good news is that it hasn't. As we've heard on Friday and as late as today, the demand remains the same, which is the men want to voluntarily surrender the Korans to the military. And they also want to have many of the things that were taken away from them by the new command on February the 6th. Communal living, the things that they have. Now, their main problem is that the military refuses to negotiate with the men, will not talk to them at all. This has been reported in the press many times. They are meeting them only with force. And I told my client, I'm going to try to get down there. I'm going to try to negotiate. He goes, you don't have to come down here. We have tongues. We can negotiate. We're human beings. But the military refuses to do so. So we're calling on the president to intervene here because this could be resolved in a week. The hunger strike could. And this is the most important thing because none of us, as the president said, want to see anybody die here. But if the military continues on its current path, the men will stay resolved and people will die. This is, again, the president's failure, unfortunately, because he doesn't have anyone in the White House charged with this responsibility. If he could get somebody charged with that responsibility, I'd have someone to call and we could resolve the hunger strike and then we can get down to the business of closing Guantanamo.
But you're right, there is no one in charge of that responsibility because the office in charge of closing Guantanamo Bay Prison closed last year. Assistant Federal Public Defender Carlos Warner, many thanks once again to you, sir, for sharing your insights here on Viewpoint.
Thank you for having me, John.
We'll have you back. For more on the politics of the issue and what might be possible to end some of the suffering at Guantanamo Bay with or without Congress's approval, I'm joined by Adam Serwer, reporter with Mother Jones. Adam, good evening. A pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, the Bush administration, as we know, transferred over 500 prisoners from Guantanamo to their home countries without a peep from our Republican friends in Congress. When did the Obama administration stop transfers, and why haven't the 86 prisoners who have already been cleared for release been sent home?
Well, the last detainee to be transferred out of Guantanamo was Omar Khadr, who was transferred to his home country of Canada to serve out his sentence. And the reason the Obama administration is having so much trouble with the 86 is that it's not just a matter of transferring them to their home countries. In some cases, they can't do that. They need to find third countries to take them. And that's very difficult from a diplomatic perspective, not in all cases, but in many cases, because, you know, the United States has refused to take any themselves, and other countries simply don't want to shoulder that responsibility when the United States isn't playing its part.
Right. Of course,
But certainly Obama could be transferring more detainees than he is, because the number he's transferring right now is 0.
And the concern we hear from the congressman is that they might be able to escape from maximum security prisons here in America like Charles Manson did so many times. The president is blaming Congress again for the stalemate over Guantanamo. You heard Counselor Warner just now talk about how under NDAA the president could do these transfers unilaterally. What did Congress do to stop the transfers and keep prisoners who aren't sent home from being brought to prisons here?
Well, first of all, I have to mention that the Republican objections are ridiculous. You know, these detainees don't have superpowers. They're not like Magneto. They're not going to escape from a Florence Supermax prison. That's never happened. But as far as what the Republicans have done, I mean, the first thing that Congress did was that it passed, and they did this when the Democrats were in charge, was that they barred the transfer of Gitmo detainees to the United States for any reason, including trial, including to serve out their prison terms. But what the Republicans did a couple of years ago was that they said anytime you transfer a detainee out of Gitmo, even if you're not bringing him to the United States, even if you're sending him abroad, the Secretary of Defense has to essentially certify that this person will never again pose a threat, which is just not a promise the Secretary of Defense can actually make. And it really puts the administration politically on the spot because they'll be very clearly liable, politically, if any of these detainees ever go on, who are released, ever go on, to commit an act of terror.
Well, apparently it is all about politics. A February ABC News Washington Post poll showed us that 70% of American adults want to keep Guantanamo Bay open and operating just as it is today. Is that the biggest reason why nothing's changed?
Well, look, the Republican Party has done an incredibly good job of frightening people with the image of Guantanamo Bay detainees, the most hardened terrorists in the world, supposedly running through, Pleasantville, USA, armed to the teeth and murdering people. But obviously, that's not really what would happen if Gitmo detainees were transferred to the United States, particularly if to serve out their sentences. They'd be in the most secure federal institutions, basically on the planet.
And again, as President Bush discovered...
But I think that image is...
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think that image is what has really, changed public opinion against Guantanamo, because when Bush was president, Bush, who said he also wanted to close Gitmo, and when Obama first took office, a majority of Americans wanted Gitmo closed.
Yes, and it's fair to say Obama ran on this in 2008 and won. And as President Bush discovered, a lot of these guys were just nobodies who were ratted out by their enemies.
Right. Well, obviously there was an incentive, for bounty reasons, to turn people in and get the money, for turning in someone who is supposedly a terrorist.
Well, let me ask you then, given all his struggles with Congress over immigration and the budget, do you think President Obama would use any of his political capital at this point on Guantanamo?
Well, honestly, I don't know. I can't make a prediction like that, but I can say that I think that if the administration decided to take on the political risk of resuming transfers, there might be a chance that the hunger strike that's now going on and that's been going on for months might actually be, there's a chance that they could actually resolve it.
How shocking would it be if NDAA wound up being the good guy here? Mother Jones reporter Adam Serwer, many thanks, sir, for some of your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.
What a pleasure. Okay, as for legal issues closer to home, not only does New York City's stop and frisk policy have an enormous racial bias, our police commissioner actually says it should have more racial bias, and we'll look at that next.